He was a stone-cold killer, conman, murderer, who seemed to have a preference for redheads. But his story would become more than just a serial killer leaving women in his wake. It would expose a level of corruption and incompetence in two prison systems that just boggles the mind. Welcome to History is Criminal. I am your host, Mick Biddick. And in this episode, we jump back to 1940s United States. A nation at war finds that life on the home front can be just as deadly as the battlefield. This one's going to take a little bit longer than normal. I thought about making it a two-parter, but I just can't quite get myself to do a two-parter. And I also couldn't figure out what to leave out in this insane story of Joseph Dunbar Medley and a killing spree that took lives of three women that we know of across two states in the District of Columbia. Joseph Medley was born in 1901 Pittsburgh. He was described as an extremely bright and fast learner, but if you listen, you might have some questions about that. Despite this, he dropped out of school in the 8th grade. This would have been around 1914 and 1915 and would not have been unusual for a kid from a working class background. What he did between the time he left school in 1922 is a little bit of a mystery, likely odd jobs, and just as likely some petty crime. In 1922, he was hired as a used car salesman. Insert your own joke here. Working for a man named J.D. Stafford. At the time, he lived in a rooming house at 4611 Hazel Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. He left Mr. Stafford's employment in 1924 and started a full life of crime. In 1927, he'd do his first major stint in jail. Medley was arrested in Little Rock, Arkansas for obtaining money under false pretenses, basically conning people. And in 1927, he was sentenced to 4 years, but he was out of jail in 2. Then he skipped out on his parole and headed to Michigan. Using his considerable charm and skills as a con man, he was able to get a job with General Motors Acceptance Corporation, today known as Ally Financial. It was 4 months later that his criminal past came to light. Having a conviction for fraud was apparently a disqualifier for working for a financial institution, but apparently not for being one. Medley was fired, and it would be the last job he would ever hold. As it turned out, crime paid a lot better anyway. 1929 saw Medley headed back to jail, this time for larceny by conversion. So larceny by conversion is theft by failing to return something that was voluntarily given to you. In this case, a car. Say, for example, you ask to borrow the neighbor's car and then drive off with no intent of returning it. You have committed larceny by conversion. I think I got a caulking gun that way, but also lost a router and 2 shovels the same way. So that router was way more expensive than the caulking gun. For Medley, this meant 4 years in the state prison in southern Michigan. Southern Michigan was maybe one of the most corrupt institutions in the history of the American prison system. It was more a crash pad for criminals than a prison. We're not talking about bribing the guard to sneak in drugs or some prisoner maybe getting some special treatment. It was far beyond that. With 6,000 inmates, it was billed as the world's largest prison, at least at the time. The deputy warden, Delisle C. Pettit, ran the prison as his own personal Sin City, and Vegas would have nothing on this place. Booze and drugs were just the tip of the iceberg. If you want a female companion, no problem. We're not talking about just wives and girlfriends routinely being smuggled in for a conjugal visit, but also prostitutes. It was said that the prison was home to a dozen stills. It being prohibition, it was easier to get booze in jail than on the outside. Had a prison-run pawn shop, a murder-for-hire gang, a casino, loan sharks, and a ring selling off pilfered government property. But the best item a prisoner could buy was a day pass. With a day pass, a prisoner, sometimes with a guard, sometimes alone, could have the run of the city. Most prisoners use the passes to see wives, girlfriends, or visit a house of prostitution, dine in fancy restaurants, sleep in the nicest hotels, But a later investigation showed that some prisoners carried out contract killings while on the day past. And that's one hell of an alibi. I couldn't have done it. I was in jail at the time. It would make you wonder why a person would ever want to leave. In fact, during this time period, not one prisoner escaped from Southern Michigan prison, at least not yet. Medley did his time and was released on March 1933. He spent the next couple months almost in a constant violation of the conditions of his release, but the parole officer in Lapeer County didn't seem to care enough to send him back to prison. This slew of petty violations seemed to have just been a way of being kind of in a holding pattern, waiting for a couple buddies from southern Michigan to get released. In May, Louis Gonyu and Melvin Brown met up with Medley in Flint, Michigan. The trio committed a string of robberies across Michigan. It was in October that the gang figured out a way to make some real money: kidnapping. Their target was Louis Brock, ex-mayor of Marshall, Michigan. Brock was one of the heirs to the Brock Rupture Appliance Company. The company had started around 1900 and became one of the leaders in mail order hernia belts. Hernia were big business, apparently. The company started in Marshall and became one of the largest mail order companies in the country, with offices in New York, London, and Paris. I'm not sure what people were doing in the early 20th century to get so many hernias, but remember, lift with your legs. On Halloween morning, the three, with a new gang member, the younger Lyle Daly, followed Brooks to a lonely country road. They overtook Brooks and forced his car off the road. Medley then took Brooks to the company headquarters and demanded that he open the safe. When Brooks refused, Medley beat him until he gave in. The safe was the jackpot with $45,000 in municipal bonds, stock, and jewelry. That's well over $1.1 million in 2026. This treasury was not enough for Medley. He announced his plan for the gang to take Brooks to Chicago and hold him for ransom. Of course, they would have to shoot him after they received the cash. You just can't leave witnesses lying around. This was a little too much for Daly. The young man was not quite as hardened as his three older compatriots. He was able to talk Medley out of the plan for ransom and murder, and Brooks was left beaten but alive on the side of a country road just 2 miles from his car. Medley and Gonyu headed to Chicago, where they sold the jewelry for 10 cents on the dollar. Meanwhile, Brown and Daly ran into some bad luck. The two were identified and arrested in Michigan. Daly proved to either have the most brains or the least guts and started to sing. He cut a deal and named names. Medley and Gonyu learned their partners had been picked up and figured it was only a matter of time until investigators had their names. The pair first headed to Little Rock, but then they needed to put a little more distance between themselves and the crime, so they headed to sunny Los Angeles. In LA, they unloaded $30,000 in bonds for $7,500. That's still almost $2,000 in 2026 dollars. Their bad luck continued as the fence they sold the bonds to was arrested the next day. Quickly, the bonds were traced to Brooks' kidnapping/robbery, and everyone knew Medley and Gonyu were in the area. So they decided to be a total cliche and head on down Mexico way. They crossed the border at San Diego into Tijuana. Now, they say Medley was smart, but you have to wonder sometimes. Instead of lying low in Mexico and letting the heat blow over, they partied hard and loud. Gonyu started seeing a young Mexican girl whose family wasn't thrilled about the loud Yankee. The family went to the local cops, figuring the gringo flashing cash had to have some kind of bad story, and they were right. Tijuana police learned the Gonyu's real identity and swore out a warrant. Gonyu was able to get one step ahead and learned they were on the way to pick him up. Now, if Medley's intelligence could be questioned at times, Gonyu's was clearly not up for debate. His getaway plan was to cross the border back into the United States, and he was immediately picked up at the border crossing in San Diego by detectives that Mexico had tipped off. As for Medley, he was smart enough to evade capture for a while. Rumors hit Marshall, Michigan newspaper that Medley had crossed the border into Texas at El Paso. Then it was said he was in Dallas, then Fort Worth. They were combing Texas looking for the 6 foot, 180 pound, good looking man with blue gray eyes. And it was a shock to the police and marshal when they got a call from Flint, Michigan, telling them that Medley had been arrested. The tip came in to Flint Police Department that Medley was under the care of a dentist who was making him a set of false teeth. The information led to an apartment, and in November 1934, 16 police officers entered the apartment. Medley gave up without a fight, despite being armed with 2 revolvers. Daly agreed to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence. He received 5 years. Brown tried to fight it in court and ended up with the harshest sentence, 40 to 60 years. Medley and Gagne both pled guilty to kidnapping and robbery, and they were sentenced to 30 to 60 years. The pair were both originally sent to Marquette Prison, but Medley, it turns out, was one hell of a talker. He was able to tell the judge that his dentist was still working on his false teeth, and it would be too much of a burden for the dentist to travel all the way to Marquette. But Southern Michigan prison was much closer and a much easier trek. The judge agreed, and Medley was sent back to Southern Michigan and Deputy Warden Pettit. During his second stay at Southern Michigan, Medley was able to use his charm and intellect to position himself among the leaders of the criminal enterprise run by Pettit. By 1944, he was working directly for Pettit as his inmate clerk. This allowed him to spend most of his time in Pettit's office drinking and smoking cigars. He was also able to get installed as the chairman of the Inmate War Bonds Drive Committee. After all, prisoners want to do their part in the war effort also. In this position, he was able to raise $850 from prisoners and guards, about 15 grand in 2026 money. On November 25th, 1944, Medley asked Guard Lieutenant Freeland to give him a ride into Jackson so he could pick up some war bond literature. Well, Jackson, being the quick thinker he was, told him he'd have to get a pass. Now, because Medley was the aide to the deputy warden, that was easy. He simply filled out the pass and gave it to Pettit to sign, no questions asked. The two left prison, and the first stop was Lieutenant Freeland's to change out of uniform. Now, why the guard needed to be out of uniform, don't know, but he put on his civvies. Back in the prison-owned card, Medley told Freeland he needed to stop by the prison bookkeeper's house to talk about the bond drive. While at the bookkeeper's house, Freeland waited in the car while Medley went upstairs. When Medley came back down, he was dressed in a dark pinstripe suit. At this point, Freeland finally decided to ask some questions, but Medley said anytime he was out of the prison working with the bookkeeper, he had him change into civilian clothing. Apparently, that was a good enough answer. Freeland drove Medley to the bank and dropped him off with instructions to meet up at the bookkeeper's home at 9:30. And the craziest thing happened. Medley never showed up. It was the first escape from Southern Michigan prison during the reign of Deputy Warden Pettit. And it was going to be one for the books. Freeland and the bookkeeper drove to the home of the deputy warden. Pettit knew this was real trouble and possibly the end of his intra-prison extracurricular enterprises. So instead of reporting the escape, they started to drive around town hoping that they would run into Medley. They hit all of his usual haunts, mainly bars and whorehouses. With no luck, they realized that Medley was gone. It was only then that they thought about the $850. Speeding back to the prison, they searched Medley's cell and found an empty box. Yeah, they must have been shocked. I mean, if you can't trust a guy with multiple felony convictions for conning people who you gave a day pass from prison, then I don't know what the world's coming to. As insane as it sounds, they still didn't sound the alarm. It wouldn't be until the next day that news of Medley's escape broke. 17 hours after simply walking away with the day pass, guards and prisoners noticed his absence. Unable to keep the lid on the story any longer, Pettit ordered Freeland to falsify the escape report. Freeland went along because, quote, Medley was a pretty good friend of Pettit's, and if I didn't play ball, I'd be on my way out. An investigation took place and a lot of people were fired, but none of that did much to help the fact that a known fugitive walked away from the prison with a new suit and enough cash to live off for the better part of a year. Medley, however, wasn't going quietly. He was off to New Orleans with a new deadly plan to make money. He would only be free for 4 months, but in that time, he would leave the bodies of 3 women in his wake. In the Big Easy on December 20th, 1944, J.D. Stafford of 4611 Hazel Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, checked into the DeSoto Hotel downtown. The tall, dark, handsome gentleman with blue-gray eyes was joined the next day by his red-haired wife, going by the name of Laura. Whether or not anybody believed the couple to be married is irrelevant. The story was enough to satisfy the front desk and the hotel detective. And yes, that was a thing in the 1940s, that nothing dirty was going to go on. The reality is the two had met just days earlier, and he had used his considerable charm to woo the younger woman. But his real goal was to rob her. And to do that, he would have to incapacitate her. On December 22nd, Laura stepped into the bath. Maybe she thought it was romantic when he came into the bathroom, or maybe she thought it was kind of weird. We don't know. What we do know is that he forced her face down into the water and held her there until she stopped fighting. Her naked body was then rolled back over into a seated position and left. He packed up her jewelry and other valuables, missing, and this is an important clue here, missing the $360 she had sewn into her bra. Calmly, he walked down to the front desk with suitcase in hand and told the clerk that he and his wife were going on a trip to a Christmas party and likely to be gone a few days. Then, almost as a second thought, he said there'd be no need to clean the room while they were gone. On Christmas Day, a maid entered the room and discovered the body still sitting in the tub. Police were called and searched the room. Suspicion fell on the husband. No ID was found in the room, nothing that gave any clue as to who the young woman was. Police guessed that the man was likely not her husband. It would seem that a husband would have known about the money hidden in the bra. But all they had to go on was tall, dark-complected, handsome, with blue-gray eyes. It would take 4 days for the FBI to return a hit on the victim's fingerprints. Her name was Laura Fisher. Laura had immigrated to the United States from Ukraine by herself in 1934. She had worked for a time in New York at a sportswear manufacturer. Then in 1943, she told her landlord she was moving to South Carolina to marry an Army sergeant. For some reason, the marriage never took place, and her trail went cold until she ended up dead in a hotel room in New Orleans. Investigators were at a loss. No forced entry, no drugs or alcohol in her system. The coroner labeled the death a, quote, possible homicide, and the cause of death was suffocation underwater, which seems an odd way to say drowning. The one thing they had to go on was a name and address given at the registration. J.D. Stafford, 4611 Hazel Avenue, Chicago. When investigators arrived at the address, they found it was a rooming house, and they asked about J.D. Stafford. No one by that name had lived in the house for at least 2 years. Police didn't know it yet, but Medley had left them a massive clue to his identity. You would think a smart guy like Medley could have made up a name, but instead he had used the name of his former boss and his own former address. But no one had put it together yet. Medley wasted little time getting out of New Orleans. By the time Laura's body was found, he was already moving on. A rich gun-toting cattleman named John H. Hanna checked into the Atlantic Hotel in Chicago. The tall, dark-complected cowboy with blue-gray eyes started making the rounds of the local bars. He was charming, loved to gamble and spend money, and show off his 2 revolvers. It was while roaming the bars that he met Lillian Snett, 35 years old and separated from her husband, and her 38-year-old married friend, the redhead, Blanche Zimmerman. It seemed like just good fun to start with. The wealthy Texan spent freely and showed the ladies a good time. For the next week, Hannah, a.k.a. Medley, if you hadn't figured that out, played both women. Although Lillian would later deny dating him, she would eventually confess to having gone on 4 or 5 dates with him. He was fun and charming. He would take each one out, always eat seafood, and play dice. Now, 1945 seafood in Chicago, I don't know if that was a good idea or not. That just might be another form of gambling. But he was fun. As the week wore on, he gravitated more towards Blanche. Maybe because she was married and he wouldn't have to worry about, the possibility of her wanting more. Or maybe it was the two large diamond rings she always wore. Despite the bling, she was not living a glamorous life. Her husband worked at a department supervisor in a gypsum company, the makers of drywall. The couple lived with her father in an apartment. Her adult son from an earlier marriage was serving the Navy. She worked as a telephone operator, her shift starting at 6 p.m. It was easy to tell her husband she had recently taken on more shifts. It seemed she was a bored, lonely housewife looking for some excitement, and the good-looking cattleman fit the bill. On the 15th of February, Hannah/Medley asked her to meet him at the hotel room the next evening. She agreed. The morning of the 16th, she kissed her husband goodbye as he headed off to work, then called the Bell Telephone of Illinois to say she wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be coming to work that day. Dressed to the nines, complete with a mink coat, she headed to the Atlantic Hotel. She made it through the lobby unnoticed and headed to Medley's room. Housekeeper noticed a woman's voice coming from the cattleman's room. She took note because he had checked in alone and there was no Miss Hannah on the books. I guess people in the 40s really just couldn't mind their own business when it came to who was in whose hotel room. On the 17th, Medley walked across the lobby to a waiting taxi. His room was paid up for the rest of the week, and a do not disturb sign hung on the door. No one found it odd. No one asked any questions. 2 hours later, the same maid who had heard the woman's voice ignored the do not disturb sign and entered the room. If it was to clean or just out of nosiness made no difference because within seconds she was running down the hallway screaming. A dead woman was in the bathtub. The Chicago police arrived on the scene to find the bathwater still warm. Chicago PD soon discovered that the scene was almost identical to a murder just weeks earlier in New Orleans. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Her clothes and jewelry were gone, no fingerprints, fake name and address. The only real difference was this time the victim's underwear was floating in the tub, causing some strange speculation on the part of the police, mostly focusing on the idea that he had gagged her with the panties. The coroner would later fail to find any water in her lungs, so wrote the death off as caused by a combination of alcohol and benzodrine. Benzodrine was a widely used amphetamine. Though an overdose can be dangerous, it seems there wasn't enough in her system to kill her, even if paired with the alcohol. Now, we would later learn that it's very possible for a person to drown without water in the lungs. The body will at times constrict the airway, known as a laryngeal spasm, to prevent water from entering the lungs. Just as in New Orleans, the death would be labeled as a possible homicide. What they did have this time was handwriting samples from the two hotels, and they were a match. And there were phone records from the Atlantic. One name that showed up in the records was Lillian Snett. Snett was able to give a description of the man, though the name was useless. She was also not completely honest with the police, claiming to have only met him once. It would take a polygraph to get her to tell the truth. The description matched the one given in New Orleans, leading them to believe this was the same killer. The story was now making national news, albeit far behind the news of the war. The Chicago Tribune had taken to calling him the two-gun gambler, and the New Orleans Times Picayune, who I'm sure I always say that newspaper name wrong, started calling him the Bathtub Slayer. As police looked into the death of Blanche, one Mr. D.J. Stafford walked into a police station in Chicago. It seemed he had heard the local police were looking for him. When Stafford introduced himself, it was clear he looked nothing like the description given by the witnesses. After hearing what the police were looking for, he gave them the name, Joseph D. Medley. Medley, a known criminal and current fugitive, having walked away from the Southern Michigan prison, soon had his face in the papers around the country and post offices listing him as a top most wanted fugitive. February 25th, 1945. A 20 something girl started a conversation with the handsome older man with gray blue eyes in Washington, D.C. restaurant. The man used the name Larry Fisher. You just can't make up a name. At least he didn't call himself Laura. He didn't talk much about himself. He said enough that she knew he worked for the government and it was wartime in Washington, D.C., so she knew not to ask too many questions about his work and that he was unmarried. The talk had gone well enough. For 3 days later, he was having dinner with the girl and her mother. The older man accompanied the mother and daughter to the movies and accepted an invitation to a card game held at the mother's home. Among the guests on March 22nd was Nancy Boyer. Boyer was an attractive divorcee in her mid 40s with red hair. She lived alone in a nice apartment building that housed some of the highest ranking military and government officials. She didn't work, but was known to have money, possibly from her divorce, but also possibly from a high stakes poker game she hosted. She would play hostess and serve as the bank and take a nice cut for the house. When Fisher/Medley quickly took a liking to Boyer and poured on the charm. The two spent nearly all their time together, and Medley convinced her to host a high stakes poker game with him at the table. Now, Medley was sure he'd clean out the elites who had come to the table. He must have felt a massive surge of confidence when he saw his competition was a group of women and only one man. He had pawned the jewelry and fur coat and was down to his last dime. He needed this game. It turns out these Washington elites knew their way around a deck of cards. He was soon cleaned out and had to ask Nancy for a loan to stay in the game. He wrote her a check for $25, about $450 today, and she cashed it out of her lockbox. He noticed what looked like more than $300 in the box. He also noticed a nice diamond and emerald ring worth well over the money in the box. As the game ended, Nancy asked him to walk one of the ladies to a taxi stand at the end of the street and then come back for breakfast. It was at about 5:30 a.m., and a watchman saw him return to the apartment building close to 7 a.m. She had set the table for breakfast and was preparing food. Medley walked in and punched her in the mouth. She went down. He started to choke her with her scarf, but that was taking too long, so he pulled out his gun and fired 3 shots. The first hit her finger and lodged in the floor. The next 2 were fatal headshots. Somehow, no one had heard these shots. He was able to leave undetected, went to his hotel, packed what little he had, and left without pain. He took the first train he could. It headed to Pittsburgh. 2 days later, as her body was discovered, he was hawking her ring for $250, about $4,500 in 2026, but still a bargain for a ring that was valued at well over $800. It was in another train headed to St. Louis. The Capitol Police began to search local pawn shops and discovered that a man matching the description given by the guest at the poker game had recently hawked jewelry in a fur coat. Inside the coat was a label connecting to a store in Chicago. The police bulletin showed Joseph Medley was wanted out of New Orleans and Chicago in connection with the death and robbery of 2 women. Capitol Police showed his picture to the witnesses and the pawn shop owner, and he was positively identified. The FBI now made finding Medley a top priority. His face was in newspapers and post offices and being shown to hotel clerks and train porters across the country. It became public knowledge that Medley was a recent escapee from the state prison in Michigan and was now on the FBI's most wanted list in connection with the murder of 3 women. The Michigan Attorney General launched an investigation in which the warden, Deputy Warden Pettit, 6 other high-ranking prison officials were all fired. Somehow, Pettit remained out of prison himself. Medley had turned the Michigan state prison system into a joke. As it turned out, it wouldn't be the last institution to suffer from his ability to charm guards. Now at the Jefferson Hotel in St. Louis, Medley registered under the name James H. Hanna of Baltimore. Again, dude, not that hard to think up a name. Steve Johnson. Boom. Did it. That easy. On March 12th, he met Mabel Moeller. at the bar at the DeSoto Hotel, now not the same one as earlier. She was an attractive 45-year-old divorcee and grandmother with blonde hair, little variety. On the 13th of March, they met up at a restaurant in his hotel. They were having a good time, judging from the loud laughter coming from the table. It was so loud that Dr. James Elder, a psychiatrist from D.C., seated at the next table, took notice. He got a strange feeling. You know, you get when you know somebody, but you can't place him. I don't know if the doctor was sitting there hoping the man didn't come over and, have that awkward moment where he knows who you are, but you have no idea what his name is. It bugged the doctor enough that he asked the people he was seated with, but no one recognized the man. He even thought to himself that maybe he had seen him in the paper, possibly someone the police were looking for, but the blonde seemed to be having a good time, so the doctor blew it off. It was still nagging him 4 days later at his home in D.C., so he dug through the stack of old newspapers waiting to be recycled for the war effort. Okay, just a quick aside. They recycled papers for the war effort during World War II. Then we just stopped for like 40 years for some reason. I have to say, we're dumb. But there on the front page of the Washington Star was a man he saw in St. Louis. He called the authorities. In St. Louis, detectives and the FBI searched his room and found Nancy's fur coat and purse. They set up surveillance of the room and set a trap for Medley. Shortly after midnight, Medley and Moeller returned to the hotel and took the elevator to his room on the 17th floor. Getting off the elevator, they found themselves surrounded by armed men. He later told police that he had planned to leave St. Louis the next morning, which, if he kept to his MO, meant that he was planning on killing Moeller that night. The trial was a slam dunk. The bullets removed Nancy matched the 38 he was arrested with. The defense tried to point the finger at another mysterious woman that had left a fingernail behind and a man that Nancy had had a relationship with. But none of that stuck. The jury wasn't buying it, and Medley was convicted of first-degree murder of Nancy Boyer. The sentence was death, scheduled for June. He was held in a D.C. jail while waiting sentence. Medley, along with a 24-year-old former Marine named Earl McFarland, escaped. The D.C. jail was only slightly better manned than Southern Michigan. The war had caused a shortage of able-bodied, competent men to work the jail, so they had resorted to hiring people they normally wouldn't have considered. Two of those men were Herbert Davis and Oscar Sanderlin. Davis's story started out with a few holes into it. According to his first account, Medley somehow just out of thin air produced a .38 pistol and forced the two guards into a cell, then forced them to hand over the uniforms. Medley and McFarland, now dressed as guards, were able to make their way to the prison roof. After a quick stop in the laundry for bed sheets, they fashioned into ropes and lowered themselves to the ground below. The real story, it turns out, was, well, a little different. First, Medley had picked the two out well in advance and had memorized their routines. He used his charms to befriend the guards into letting them stay out of their cells late in the night playing cards. He knew the guards well enough to know that Sutherland would begin to complain of stomach pains and Davis was prone to falling asleep in the early morning hours. And like clockwork, Sutherland started to complain of a stomach ache, and Medley suggested that he go lay down in his cell. This was something the guards apparently routinely did. Then, as predicted, as the card game reached the early hours of the morning, Davis fell asleep. It was simple for the two death row inmates to relieve Davis of his uniform and toss him into McFarland's cell. Then lock Sutherland in Medley's cell. Sutherland later admitted handing over his uniform and wallet despite the fact the criminals had no gun and he was locked inside the cell with the prisoners locked outside the cell. From that point, the escape pretty much follows the original version, except for the rope was 10 to 15 feet too short. Now, the 24-year-old Marine simply hit the ground, was able to tuck and roll, and get on with his business. The middle-aged Medley hit the ground and snapped his ankle. Injured, cold, and with no money, Medley attempted to hide in a drain pipe at the nearby Anacostia River. His plan was to wait for the pain to die down in the cover of night. Within 7 hours, a competent officer found Medley hiding in the pipe. He put up no fight as he was taken back to jail. McFarland lasted 8 days until he was picked up in Nashville. Medley was still a national sensation. His escape a second time and recapture made national headlines. Though broken and looking worse for the experienced, he used his ever present charm to give a quote to the press. "You can't hate a guy for trying," he said with a grin. "I'm just glad no one got hurt. But I tell you this, I'll try again if I get a chance. You can stick that in your pipe and smoke it." He didn't get another chance. Appeals and an attempt at insanity plea gave him another 8 months. There was even a request to President Truman to grant clemency, but failed. Truman dropped 2 nukes on Japan. I don't think he felt much sympathy for a guy who murdered 3 women. At 12:44 p.m. on December 20th, 1946, holding a rosary, he received 20,000 volts of electricity. It seems that the petty theft turned conman turned kidnapper, then murderer, was far too organized for Lord Fisher to have been his first victim. It seems too clean, too planned. If he did have other victims, then they had been lost to the dustbin of history. But Joseph Medley will forever hold a spot among the evil men doing anything for $1. This has been History is Criminal. Join us next week and we'll be at a regular length for the story of Nanny Doss, the giggling granny. But trust me, you do not want to get cookies from this grandma. Until then, if you liked what you heard, tell a friend. If not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.